During the Second World War, the Soviet Union had a secret weapon: witches. Yes, you heard correctly. The Red Army deployed witches at night to fly around and attack the Germans. But they didn't fly on broomsticks. Instead, they flew crappy wooden planes. And they weren't really witches, just everyday women fighting for their country. When you picture female contributions to World War II on a global scale, you might picture women working as combat nurses or manufacturing war material in factories. People don't generally picture women in actual combat because most weren't. However, in the Soviet Union, 800,000 women served in the Soviet armed forces, and at least 89 of them went on to earn the Hero of the Soviet Union, the USSR's highest military honor. The women who served in the Red Army were snipers, tank drivers and mechanics, and pilots. The pilots, in particular, were so successful in combat that the Germans came to fear them and refer to them as the Night Witches. In this video, we're going to dive into the story of the Night Witches and what they did to terrify the Germans so much. When Germany attacked the Soviet Union in June 1941, many women volunteered for the Red Army, but were turned away due to, well, being women. It wasn't until later in Operation Barbarossa, when the Soviets were desperate, that the door opened for women to join the Red Army. Many joined as nurses, doctors, and even surgeons, but for every woman who entered the medical field, there was another who was ready to fight. Some of the women who were trained up for action were already pilots or had some kind of flying experience. Many of them wrote to a woman named Marina Raskova, asking what they could do to serve. Raskova had become a famous pilot since the early 1930s and was known as the Russian Amelia Earhart for her record-setting long-distance flight and her skills as a navigator. She began serving as a navigator for the Soviet Air Force in 1933, and though she faced a lot of criticism from her male comrades, she more than proved herself capable, eventually becoming an instructor for new male recruits, and later female ones as well. Receiving letter after letter, Raskova used her personal connections to Stalin to establish an all-female regiment. Once she had it, she formed the 122nd Aviation Corps, in which women trained as pilots, engineers, and ground crew. The Corps was eventually broken up into 3 regiments: the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment, the 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment, and the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. The latter is the focus of our story. Though Raskova had founded the 588th Regiment, it was commanded by Major Yevdokia Bershenskaya, a skilled female pilot with 10 years of flight experience. There were a total of 400 women in the regiment, aged from 17 to 26 years old. When they arrived for training, they were issued oversized uniforms and boots made for female soldiers and were forced to cut their hair short. They were barely able to recognize themselves, but they didn't let it bother them, and they threw themselves into their flight training. They had to learn in a few months what it took some male pilots in the USSR years to learn, and every single one of them had to train in multiple jobs as a pilot, maintenance person, navigator, and ground crew. And if all that training wasn't enough pressure on the female pilots, they were often belittled by the male military personnel who felt women couldn't possibly make a difference in the fighting. They experienced harsh remarks and even sexual harassment from their male counterparts, but the strongest evidence of their ill treatment was the equipment they were issued. Never mind the boots so big they had to be stuffed with ripped bed sheets to fit properly, the planes the 588th Regiment flew had been obsolete long before World War II had even started. The planes they piloted were Polikarpov PO-2 biplanes, 2-seater open cockpit aircraft made of plywood and oiled canvas. The former Chief of Staff of the 588th Regiment, Irina Rakoboskaya, recalled, "If you jabbed your finger at the wing, you'd make a hole in it." The planes offered no protection from the frigid Soviet night air. In winter, touching the fuselage mid-flight would tear off skin. But protection from the cold was not the only luxury the pilots had to go without. The planes were so sensitive to weight that the pilots couldn't carry parachutes, guns, radios, or radar devices. The only tools they could have on board were maps, compasses, pencils, rulers, stopwatches, and flashlights. One of the pilots, Nadia Popova, recalled, when the wind was strong, it would toss the plane. In winter, when you'd look out to see your target better, you got frostbite. Our feet froze in our boots, but we carried on flying. The planes could also only fly at just under 100 miles per hour, whereas German planes of that era had a top flight speed of 400 miles per hour. However, the slowness of the old Soviet planes actually proved to be an advantage somewhat. Because the maximum speed of the Polikarpov PO2 was slower than the German stall speed, the Soviet pilots could maneuver their planes better than the Germans could maneuver theirs. The Polikarpov PO2s could also take off and land almost anywhere. However, they had absolutely no protection against enemy fire, and if struck even by tracer bullets mid-flight, the whole plane would burst into flames and plummet to Earth. With so much stacked against the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, you wouldn't think they would find success, but oh boy, did they ever. The 588th Regiment's first bombing run took place on June the 8th, 1942, and by the end of the war, the unit had flown 30,000. They flew harassment and precision bombing missions with the objective of killing Germans and driving the survivors crazy. Every night, they would send out as many as 40 two-person crews to carry out these operations. Because the PO2s could only hold 2 bombs at a time, one under each wing, when they completed a bombing run, they would circle back, pick up fresh bombs, refuel, and take off again. Each crew carried out as many as 18 runs in a single night. The biplanes were always extremely vulnerable. On top of being made from wood and fabric, they had to fly low to the ground in order to accurately deliver their payloads. Because of their great age and outdated construction, the planes were also extremely loud, so to avoid detection, the pilots had to cut the engines as they neared their target. The regiment would send 3 planes out together for each mission. 2 would draw enemy searchlights and fire, while the 3rd would silently drop its bombs. Sometimes, the bombs wouldn't release and the crews would have to climb onto the wings to release the bombs manually. Because of the aircraft's wooden frame, they didn't show up on radar, making them like ghosts in the sky. However, despite their stealth, they were sometimes spotted and shot at. Nadia Popova recalled a bombing run where she was fired upon relentlessly. When she returned to base, she counted 42 bullet holes in her plane, plus bullet holes in her map and even her helmet. But she didn't let that stop her from swooping her enemy and delivering more bombs. When the planes glided over their targets, they made a whooshing sound like a witch's broom, so the Germans began calling them Nachthexen, which translates to night witches. The pilots saw the name as a badge of honor and happily referred to themselves as witches. The Germans couldn't believe they were being bested by, in some cases, teenage girls. Rumors spread through German camps that the Soviets were giving the night witches pills that made them see in the dark like cats. This was nonsense, of course. What we did have were clever, educated, very talented girls, said Nadezhda Popova, a night witch who ran 852 missions and earned herself the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. While they were laughed at and treated with disdain by their male colleagues simply for being women, the night witches never let that bother them and they always embraced their femininity. One of the 12 commandments of the night witches was to take pride in being a woman. They spent some of their downtime taking part in activities like dancing, needlework, and decorating their planes, often with paintings of flowers. They even used the pencils they were given for navigating purposes as eyeliner, because whoever said you can't look cute while killing Germans? The Night Witches flew their last mission on May the 4th, 1945, just 3 days before Germany surrendered. By the end of the war, they had lost 30 pilots in total. Of the surviving pilots, 24 of them were awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, making the Witches the most decorated unit of the Soviet Air Force. However, they were not included in the giant Victory Day parade in Moscow because the powers that were decided that their planes were too slow. Today, the Night Witches are fondly remembered in Russia for their incredible contributions to the Soviet war effort. It wasn't until somewhat recently that their story made it to the West, however, and it has since captured the minds of women and men alike. But what do you think about the Night Witches? Does their story deserve more attention? Do you think the low speed of their planes was the only reason they weren't allowed to fly in the victory parade? Do you think they could have been even more successful if they had better planes, or were their crappy planes the reason they did so well? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.